Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome the people who have joined us in person as well as the people joining us online. Of course, we never know how many people are registered or actually appearing online, but we had about 200 people signed up, so pretty good turnout online. For anyone who might be joining the Mass Historical Society for the first time, MHS is the first historical society in America. We date all the way back to 1791. As I like to joke, when MHS was founded, our founding director wrote to Paul Revere, and Paul Revere wrote back. So for the last 232 years, we've been maintaining a research library and making materials related to Massachusetts and American history available to researchers and the public. As we often do with many of our programs, we pulled some material from our collection for a display that was in the Douse Library, and I hope the people who are joining us in person had a chance to see that. So there's some great documents that will be touched on by our speaker this evening. Beyond holding a great research library, we also host a wide variety of programs. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors. So we hope that you'll return for future events. And we hope that if you enjoy our programs, you'll consider becoming a member or donating to support MHS. This evening, we're happy to welcome Dr. Philip Stern, who is an associate professor of history at Duke University. His work focuses on various aspects of the legal, political, intellectual, and business histories that shaped the British Empire, including overseas ventures such as the Massachusetts Bay Company. Dr. Stern will speak about his new book, Empire Incorporated, which explores the impact of venture colonialism and the ramifications that are still being felt today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stern.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gavin, for that introduction. I want to thank Olivia for all of the help in arranging today, Peter for that wonderful exhibit out there, which really made my day. It's actually quite an honor and extremely appropriate and frankly, a little intimidating to be more or less launching my new book, Empire Incorporated, which was published only about 2 weeks ago here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. As I was telling several of you earlier today, I had a grand plan to be working here on this book to some extent. I think the plan was to come sometime around early April 2020. I don't know what happened around then that derailed my plans, but so I was left with what turns out to be an amazing wealth of materials that can be accessed remotely, including published materials and other people's work based upon a number of people who have spoken to this group before. In a way, some of you here, some of you, the many people online, probably have more right to speak about the history of Massachusetts than myself. I came to this project as a historian of the British Empire, whose work had largely focused, one might say, more on Bombay than on Boston. I wrote a previous book called The Company State, which attempted to explain how the English East India Company, a commercial corporation established by charter in 1600, had come to rule over a vast territorial and maritime empire by the later 18th century. My answer in that book, in short, not the talk for today, was that that premise was completely flawed, that the East India Company had never been a trader that turned into a sovereign, but in fact that by virtue of being a corporation, it had been a political form of governance since its founding and certainly by the end of its first century. From there, something happened, a bit like a fever dream, maybe like that phenomenon you've all had where you learn a new word and then you start to see it everywhere. I saw corporations all over the place. I couldn't stop it. Corporations, corporate-like bodies seemed to appear to me. They would appear to me in history. They would appear to me while I was eating dinner. It was disturbing. But from 16th century Irish plantations to 20th century concessionaries in the Mandate Middle East, it became clear to me that the story that I had told in The Company State was both bigger and different than the story just about the East India Company. At first, I figured maybe all of this was pretty much the same, but the more I looked into it, the more complicated the story seemed to be. Sure, there were a number of other large companies for territorial rule, which some historians have flatteringly also come to call company states, such as the Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, or the British South Africa Company in the late 19th century. But how are they connected? And what about all those other corporations and joint stock companies I kept coming across? It turned out that the company state, as a kind of concept of a large territorial company for governance, was a dominant species that only thrived within a broad and diverse ecosystem of enterprises for trade, land and settlement, not to mention transportation and public works, financial services and resource extraction, military services, philanthropy and philosophy. You had joint stock groups for piracy. You had joint stock groups of joint stocks engaged in the enslavement of human beings. You had learned societies, missionary enterprises, universities, not quite joint stocks, but corporations to be sure, not to mention towns and colonies that were themselves, quote unquote, governors and companies. The most iconic one of them, of course, being the Governor and Company of Massachusetts Bay. Company promoters could be the kinds of gentlemanly capitalists some of you may be familiar with from the work of P.J. Cain and A.G. Hopkins, but they were also social climbers, quixotic philosophers, scam artists, and felons who turned to companies precisely because they were ostracized rather than accepted by polite and political society. Likewise, even those larger, more well-known companies were often not single companies precisely, but complexes of subsidiaries and financing structures fueled less by immense capital than by great debt. One example that I became rather obsessed with in writing the book was about one early 18th century projector by the name of John Welb. Welb had sailed with William Dampier to the South Seas in the late 17th century, and then when he got back to London, made it a lifetime mission to return, coming up with any number of schemes to try to get himself back and make a fortune in the meantime. Most of those schemes he came up with while sitting in one of London's many debtors' prisons. He tried to get patrons in the Danish East India Company, the Danish Crown. He tried to get George I and Hans Sloane of the Royal Society to support him. When that didn't work, he decided, let's try investors. Didn't have a charter because there was another company for the South Seas at that same time with them somewhat good advertising of being the South Sea Company. And he, at that point, decided he was going to try to get a new charter. Didn't have any money to go for that new charter. So had this idea, which was not entirely uncommon, of selling what he called permits. So for 1 shilling now, you could have a permit to reserve the right for a £100 share later when they were certainly going to be radically in demand. No one actually bought any of these shares or any of these permits. So he offered for 1 shilling now the ability to buy a £100 share later. I guarantee you 3 or 4 of you have a number of these emails in your spam box at the moment, right? Many were joint stocks without being corporations. Or raise the ambiguity of just exactly how you made a corporation in the first place, because that, it turned out, was a surprisingly controversial question legally. While some corporations emerged to remedy what their projectors envisioned as the evils of joint stock companies. I was talking about this earlier today at the reception, that the colony of Georgia, for example, was a corporation, but founded to be a different kind of corporation in antithesis to the joint stock company as a trusteeship and a form of charity. Some endure to this day, others, like Georgia, failed pretty quickly, or were never more than mere fantasies or thought experiments. Many were aggressively English or British in their self-image, while mirroring similar corporate enterprises elsewhere in Europe, and even powered by investors, employees, and sources of sovereignty and jurisdiction drawn from both European and indigenous peoples and polities. In this book, then, I set out to tell the story of the gradual union of the corporation and the joint stock commercial form as both an organizational and an ideological strategy for the expansion of empire. In my mind, and to describe this in the book and towards the beginning, the book is like an intergenerational intellectual biography of a concept and an institution, which traces the genealogy of what I call in the book venture colonialism. The idea that's connected across the centuries based upon the provocative notion that colonialism worked best, in the words of the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, in his own manuscript thought experiment for a joint stock colonial enterprise in Australia, when, quote, government will not intermeddle with the business of government. I also came to think of it as a kind of minor character study in which one might displace traditional stories by recentering a familiar narrative from the perspective of a normally supporting character and see what version of the story comes out then. Think of it as the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern or Wicked of the British Empire. From this vantage, several such connections, patterns, and perspectives began to emerge. It was striking not only how much of modern empire looked like its early modern forebears, but how many of its promoters and ideologues followed in that tradition quite self-consciously, mobilizing history to make arguments for how and why colonial expansion should happen, and happen in this particular way. 16th century advocates for quote unquote private colonization in Ireland cited the Marcher Lords, who laid the ground for Anglo-Norman settlement in the 12th century. 17th and 18th century colonial projects founded themselves on revived patents or recycled patents of previous ventures, even ones that had long gone defunct. Across the 19th century, company promoters looked back to those bygone companies and colonies, citing examples from the 17th century Atlantic to the East India Company, even after it had been wrested of its power somewhat ignominiously, to make the case that, as one promoter of the British South Africa Company put it, such late 19th century companies in Africa were, quote, simply the latest page in the long series of transactions to which our worldwide empire owes its existence. In short, the argument for colonial companies was not necessarily that they represented novel, modern capitalist innovation, though that was not absent from the discussion, but rather because this was the way it had always been done. It was more traditional than a state empire. As a fundamentally historical and legal project, then, the colonial corporation also inherited the corporation's historical baggage. Today, of course, the word will most immediately bring to mind a commercial enterprise, but its origins and as a legal and political concept lay, in fact, in a quite different world, in the church and continental monarchies and empires of medieval Europe, where the idea of an abstract entity through which groups of people could self-govern and act, helped jurists conceptualize the existence of complex, overlapping, and semi-autonomous forms of political community, such as a church parish or an urban municipality. In the 18th century, the word corporation would have probably brought to mind most immediately a town or a university. The concept, however, soon raised a conceptual paradox. On the one hand, corporate theory allowed some to develop an idea of a society as made up of many overlapping and sometimes competing self-governing societies, principles that informed the development of everything from Huguenot resistance theory to modern federalism and pluralism. On the other hand, the idea of a juristic person, created by law, but in some sense greater than the sum of its parts, provided the foundation for imagining something like the Pope or kings and queens as having two bodies, one personal, mortal, what we might call the body natural, the monarch, the other public, immortal, the body politic, the monarchy. And from there, providing the fundamental building blocks for imagining pluralism's theoretical opposite number, the singular transcendent modern sovereign state. Thus, there was a certain dilemma built into the corporation's intellectual DNA. Was it subordinate to sovereign power or a source of sovereign power unto itself? Such ambiguities, though critical in Europe, were dramatically amplified as the model was applied by the 16th and 17th centuries to order a variety of schemes for overseas colonization and commerce. According to most early modern English common law jurists, incorporation was an extension of the royal prerogative, conferred like many offices, franchises, and immunities by instruments known as letters patents, sometimes loosely called charters. Charters were not easy to get, requiring political and financial connections, or, as Rhode Island's frustrated London agent complained in the early 1660s, a, quote, silver key and, quote, private entranceway that was available to some and not available to others. Even at home, however, once granted, corporate charters were far easier for the crown to giveth than to taketh away, often requiring the actual physical repossession of the document itself, which had to be either voluntarily surrendered or seized through surprisingly complicated and unpredictable legal actions with names like quo warranto and scior facias, and tried before various courts like the Court of Chancery or the Court of King's Bench. Even as it became easier to make a corporation as this process was gradually democratized over the centuries, first in the 18th and 19th centuries through parliamentary bills of incorporation, and eventually the introduction in the mid-19th century of an administrative process for company formation, with which we are probably more familiar these days, it became more, not less, legally fraught to unmake a corporation without the consent of its owners or leadership. Yet, even though, in a sense, charters for overseas trade and settlement closely resembled patents for municipalities, universities, and other franchises and offices at home, it turned out they translated awkwardly into a world where the nature of sovereignty, jurisdiction, and even geography itself was so uncertain. To be clear, even the crown did not necessarily think that it had sovereignty prima facie abroad, and charters did not, as they are often colloquially imagined, pretend to give it. What they could offer instead were, as with these domestic enterprises, the imprimatur of royal backing, a kind of constitution that laid out modes of governance, and most valuably, particular legal immunities, including the expectation in theory that their holders held exclusive rights, among other English subjects, to go out and somehow establish these commercial property and jurisdictional rights for themselves, whether through conquest, seizure, and most often, treaties and contracts with other Europeans and indigenous peoples, or some combination of the three. Who then had the right of jurisdiction and sovereignty once these rights were established in such a manner, settlers, the crown, or indigenous sovereigns, remained an unsettled and constantly litigated question over the course of this period in different ways and different times, and of course, as the book spans 400 years, this all is a kind of summary that certainly has nuances as things move forward in time. At the same time, these supposedly exclusive English charters often projected themselves onto such absurdly vast and geographically nonsensical spaces that they almost always and immediately invited challengers, a situation not helped at all by the fact that the Crown routinely and thickly granted these exclusive patents and charters that impinged on, overlap with, and contradicted one another. Anybody who's familiar with the history of the border disputes between any of the American colonies will sort of know what I mean here. To make matters even more complicated, both corporate and individual patentees explicitly or implicitly derive from their patents the prerogative to issue grants that looked a lot like patents, able to grant or sell rights of jurisdiction or land unto others, even when such rights were merely theoretical, and in some cases before a single voyage had even set out. The result was constant competition, dispute, conflict, and not infrequently violence among British subjects abroad, which overall ironically propelled further expansion and over time naturalized both forms of violence and various claims to dispossession of territory, derived from the notion that such had been consensually acquired, either through contracts or treaties of sale or the violation of some conditions of the law. So with their capacity to constitute forms of self-governance, and hold and defend property across generations, corporations were particularly adept at this mode of colony formation. Organizing that corporation as a joint stock company meant not only that it could raise greater sums of money than individuals, and even more frequently and importantly, great debts, which were much harder to recover from a company than a person, but that such property belonged not only to, I mean, just to pause for a second, you can throw a debtor in jail, you cannot throw a company in jail, as John Weld found out. But that such property belonged not only to the company itself, but a portion or share of it, quite literally to each of its individual shareholders, over time produced rights to rights, rooted in both English and non-European sources of sovereignty, but also English and then later British property law that were all that much harder to undo. As the satirist Horace Walpole put it about the East India Company's territorial conquest in the 1760s, its leadership had, quote, labored to their utmost to make the usurpation of 3 Indian provinces, or rather kingdoms, pass for private property. At the same time, joint stock corporations allowed for a certain kind of risk tolerance and experimentation. In a sense, for corporate colonialism to succeed, many, many individual companies and corporations had to fail miserably or never see the light of day, merely just fantasies on the page. The model also allowed for people to participate, in a sense, in multiple colonial ventures at once and at a distance, what I call in the book a form of portfolio colonialism. It's arguably that this not only helped to fuel the financial foundations for these ventures, but also created a kind of moral distance in which civil society was more broadly implicated in empire than merely just the state, but also allowed for people to sort of participate at a distance and at a moral remove from the kinds of ventures in which they were investing. Such ventures were also quite frequently fueled by the capacity to take on debts, as I've mentioned, often with very little consequence. And in the case of many colonial companies, to essentially run what seems to be a little like a Ponzi or a pyramid scheme, paying out dividends in cash, not in cash, but in theoretical grants of land, which it fell to those shareholders themselves or their assignees to actually settle and cultivate to make real. At the same time, while theoretically in competition with other models, such as individual seniorial proprietorships, the reality was that joint stock and corporate enterprises infused these other colonial forms as well. You may be familiar, say, with the proprietor William Penn of Pennsylvania, for example, who issued patents and made large-scale land sales to a number of joint stock company projects in Pennsylvania to help forward the process of converting land into property, not to mention charters for urban corporations, most notably like Philadelphia. While Carolina, a proprietorship by council, represented a curious synthesis of proprietorial, corporate, and other medieval modes of land tenure and governance. Even the growing state's own evolving imperial ambitions were built to some extent through corporate enterprises. There were, of course, many company projects, which from the Royal Fisheries Company to the Royal African Company in the 17th century to something like the British Overseas Airways Corporation, which became British Airways in the 20th century, that not only literally brought the crown or the state's imprimatur and its financing, but also were significantly tied to members of the royal family, key advisors to the crown, or the state agencies itself, if not the monarch, him or herself. Yet even more significantly and pervasively was the fact that so much of what we think of as the British Empire, that is the one paid for and governed by the state, was built by absorbing and adapting, in another sense of it being an empire incorporated, corporate and company colonies into its own fold. from Charles I's declaration in 1625 that the Virginia Company's colony would henceforth, quote, depend upon ourself, to Queen Victoria's proclamation in the wake of the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the Government of India Act of 1858, quote, to take upon ourselves the government of the territories of India. Even as such processes mounted argument after argument against the propriety and effectiveness of corporate colonialism, new companies still continued to appear, a game of colonial corporate whack-a-mole in a sense. There was also a lingering sense among some advisors that as the British Empire emerged, as Edmund Burke put it, even while prosecuting the impeachment of East India Company Governor General Warren Hastings, there were many ways in which, quote, the counting house gave lessons to the state. A century later, one propagandist for the British South Africa Company put it even more bluntly and put a finer point on it. The British Empire, James Rochefort Maguire observed, was really like, quote, a gigantic company of which the imperial executive is the board of directors and whose dividends came in the form not only of money, but also in reputation and power alike. After all, Maguire quipped, is it not our boast that we are a nation of shopkeepers? In short, the corporation's fundamental dilemma rested in the fact that it could be understood as an extension of sovereign power, a check on sovereign power, a corruption of sovereign power, and a sovereign power unto itself. Thus, by the early 20th century, observers would liken the corporation to Frankenstein's monster, warning of a form of life caught somewhere between the Baroque and the Gothic, cobbled together from parts into something artificial, unnatural, volatile, and dangerous. But as the political theorist Harold Lasky reminded his readers, those corporations, like the creature, also had a tendency to, quote, show ingratitude to their creators, evading, resisting, and even rebelling against, quote, the state which in legal theory at any rate gave it birth. To illustrate his point, Lasky had two examples, the English East India Company and the Company and Colony of Massachusetts Bay. So now that I've abused an audience of the Massachusetts Historical Society with ideas and examples from anywhere but Massachusetts, in the time I have left, I thought I might illustrate some of the ways this all looked from the perspective of Massachusetts and New England, more generally in my book, and the role that Massachusetts and New England plays in the story that I tell. Of course, I only have time to go over a little bit of it, but I'm happy to talk about more when we have a chance to discuss afterwards. So much of late 16th and early 17th century expansion into the Atlantic world was the work of combinations of joint stock and corporate enterprises, from Humphrey Gilbert's self-constituted and rather uncreatively named The Merchant Adventurers with Humphrey Gilbert, or his half-brother Sir Walter Raleigh's patents to the governor and assistants of the city of Raleigh in Virginia, intended to fund and organize a colonial venture to Roanoke that famously and infamously disappeared. Not to mention a Russia company that began its life in 1553 as a joint stock company, chartered as a corporation in 1555, with the predominant purpose of searching out a passage to the Indies, either through a northeast or a northwest passage. These late 16th century enterprises, in turn, served both directly and indirectly as foundations for their even more well-known early 17th century offspring, just to name a few. The Levant Company, the East India Company, the Irish Society, several iterations of a Northwest Passage Company, a Newfoundland Company, an Amazon Company, not that Amazon Company, among several other joint stock projects for aiming and settling Guyana. And of course, the Virginia Company, originally a royal council that was to supervise two companies. One, a set of investors from Plymouth for planting the northern parts of North America, Plymouth, England, whose first settlement at Sagadoc and the company itself failed within the first year of its establishment. And another, more enduring one centered on London that established its first colony at Jamestown in 1607. That London Virginia Company was reestablished as an independent corporation by charters in 1609 and 1612, but its joint stock never proved adequate to its task. Over the next decade, its evolving leadership turned not only to an aggressive publicity and propaganda campaign, but to a number of financing strategies, loans, bonds, a series of lotteries, and a number of joint stocks to fund particular projects, including most controversially for a monopoly supply company or magazine company, and perhaps most famously, what was in fact a subsidiary joint stock company mostly made up almost entirely of Virginia Company investors, or what would be called at the time adventurers or undertakers, to forward the company's claims to Bermuda, which soon received separate royal patents itself of incorporation as the Somers Isles Company, Somers Islands Company. By the late 1610s, the Virginia Company also began to encourage what were essentially joint stock plantations, in which individual shareholders were encouraged to pool the land grants they received in exchange for their subscriptions or for settling into much larger settlements. A number of such settlements emerged. The most well-known of which, however, many of you may know, did not end up in Virginia at all. A group of expatriate English nonconformists living in Leiden, which acquired such a land grant from the Virginia Company and, aided by London-based investors, funded their transatlantic voyage on the Mayflower, only to ultimately end up near here and laid the ground for what became known as the Plymouth Colony. Even the so-called Mayflower Compact, Samuel Eliot Morison argued some time ago, was less anomalous than it was typical of the mutual agreements entered into by many of these Virginia, quote unquote, particular plantations. It was also quite similar to mutual compacts that you can find elsewhere. For example, the settlement of lowland Scots in Lewis in the first decade of the 17th century, as a project of a group come to be known as the Fife Adventurers. The status of this settlement would, however, soon be even further complicated by an effort underfoot in 1620 to revive the now defunct Northern Virginia Company in the form of a new corporation called, for short, the Council for New England. Though initially imagining undertaking colonial settlement directly through either a joint stock or a subsidiary joint stocks based in West Country port towns, kind of on a Dutch model, the council soon began to resemble a lot less the Virginia Company than it did its neighboring Newfoundland Company, forwarding settlement and plantation by selling or issuing patents to others, including many to its own members, to Ferdinando Gorges and John Mason for what would become New Hampshire, Maine, and with others in joint stock, a Laconia Company aiming to discover and settle the Great Lake of the Iroquois. A joint stock association known as the Company of Husbandmen or the Company of the Plow, which several layers of sales later ended up proclaiming themselves to be the autonomous colony of Ligonia, named after Gorges's mother. The 1632 grant from the Earl of Warwick to Lord Say, Brooke, and many others were what came to be known, again, not all that cleverly, the Saybrook Company, which laid the foundations with other corporations like that of New Haven for Connecticut and, in a way, the Pequot War of 1636. And of course, in the mid-1620s, to a company out of Dorchester, England, which would settle a colony and fishing stages at Cape Ann before being reformed as the New England Company, and then with royal patents emerging by 1628, 1629 as the Governor and Company of Massachusetts Bay in New England. The incorporation of the Massachusetts Bay Company, of course, formed the foundation for a government in Massachusetts for the next half century and arguably beyond that. Much more immediately, it seemed was taken as an existential threat to Plymouth, which had been engaged in periodic and violent conflict with the Cape Ann settlers over its own claims to those fishing stages, and which had gotten a simultaneous patent from another member of the Council for New England. The only solution, those London-based investors, who would soon divest themselves of their shares to the colonists, for anyone who knows the story, the only solution, they argued, was to get their own royal charter, so as, quote, to confirm their grant and make you a corporation, and so to enable you to make and execute laws in such large and ample a manner as the Salem or Massachusetts plantation hath it. Plymouth's London agent, Isaac Allerton, failed to do so, but his efforts fueled growing opposition to the company in England, both from others like Mason and Gorges in battle with the company over rival claims to territory and jurisdiction in New England, as well as Crown officials like the Archbishop William Laud, for whom the impudence of Massachusetts' anti-episcopal, decentralized, nonconformist churches and routine flouting of royal authority were all evidence that the colony, in the words of historian Mark Peterson in his remarkable The City-State of Boston, thought of its charter more like, quote, a malleable set of guidelines and a, quote, license to evade the authority of the king. Calls to cancel the company's charter, pushed by Mason, Gorges, and the lawyer Thomas Morton, led to a writ of quo warranto, which in 1637, the Court of King's Bench unsurprisingly decided in favor of the Crown, authorizing it to, quote, seize their, that is to say, the Massachusetts Bay Company's franchises. There was, however, a problem. And I'm about to tell you a story. The story is much better told in the amazing documents and map that are put out in the case in the other room out there, which I highly encourage you to go look at if you haven't seen before. It's amazing material that I wish I had access to and put in the book. The company had been established as tensions between the Crown and the English Puritans in Parliament, increasingly one and the same, had reached a fevered pitch in the wake of the issuing of the Petition of Right in 1628 and Charles's proroguing of Parliament, just as the company was finalizing its charter in 1629. In a move that has now taken on the stuff of legend, the leadership of the Massachusetts Bay Company had attempted to steel themselves against the coming storm by formally fixing their government to New England and even literally transporting what they sort of thought of as their charter with them across the Atlantic. Thus, though in theory, quote unquote, outlawed for failure to show at the summons of the quo warranto, the term means by what warrant, which questions the legitimacy of the company to operate under its charter. The fact that the charter itself could not be physically repossessed, and that the vast majority of those named in the quo warranto could simply ignore the summons being an ocean away without consequence, government in Massachusetts was left both technically abrogated and never more autonomous, possibly. The fact that Massachusetts itself was a governor and company was mirrored in the corporate character of New England political culture more generally, inseparable in a sense from the local and community-based nature of nonconformist anti-Episcopalian religious life. In this sense, from this moment on, and in fact, before then, some of the details that I've sort of given you, it is left in Massachusetts now to reproduce and mirror the model of corporate formation that we kind of see also happening out of England, spreading across the world. Hopefully that point will become clear in a minute. Such foundations, the kind of corporateness of New England life, could be mobilized by critics as much as advocates for Massachusetts' expansion. Roger Williams, for example, observed in 1646 that any church was like, quote, a company of worshipers, akin to, quote, a body or college of physicians in a city, a corporation, society, or company of East India and Turkey merchants, or any other society or company in London. Corporate and joint stock organization at the same time conditioned the expansion of settlement in Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England in the form of towns which looked very much like hybrids of urban corporations and land companies, with their founding covenants, mutual compacts, articles of association, purchases of indigenous territory, and assembly-granted exclusive rights to land and self-government distributed in proportion to investment to both resident and absentee shareholders, and in some cases exhibiting an ecumenical mix of commercial, territorial, and political objectives. From the Nashaway undertakers established to settle, mine, and trade along the Nashua River, to the 1663 attempt by a joint stock of Massachusetts and English adventurers looking to establish a plantation on the other Charles River, closer to where I live than many of you do, known as the Cape Fear in the Carolinas. The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company was a mercantile, political, and social and religious fellowship established in 1638 to control both 1,000 acres of land and a private militia, which Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop once snidely likened to a Roman Praetorian Guard or the Knights Templars. Many of its members, in turn, adventured in the 1644 Lake of the Iroquois Company, a free company of adventurers, quote unquote, intending to revive the failed Laconia Company project to occupy lands and make prize of interlopers, undertake exclusive trade and self-government, quote, as is granted to such companies in other parts. Such a model also informed the borderland praying towns that furthered both settlement and missionary enterprise under a different corporation, the Company for the Promoting and Propagating the Gospel of Jesus Christ in New England, colloquially known as the New England Company, or sometimes in New England just the corporation. Chartered first by Parliament in 1649 and then again by the restored King Charles II in the early 1660s. As Connecticut Governor John Winthrop Jr. argued in his own proposal to the New England Company for an agricultural and commercial farm or settlement, quote, the way to raise such a stock may be by motion from the corporation, not as in former transactions by a collection of stock in a free gift by way of charity, but only a supply for valuable consideration. That is, joint stock investment, not philanthropy, in Winthrop's argument, was the key to sustaining plantation and proselytization alike. Winthrop was also a central player in the late 1650s in an even more audacious venture, often called after one of its principal investors, the Artillery Company member, land speculator, and Massachusetts political leader Humphrey Atherton, as the Atherton Company or Syndicate, which infamously managed to settle some 400 square miles of Narragansett land through what one could only best describe as a protection racket. For those of you unfamiliar with the story, in a nutshell, the Atherton Group, having first managed to effect a purchase of some land reportedly involving repeated threats of violence from a Narragansett sachem, then contrived to loan a number of Narragansett sachems money to pay an exorbitant fine levied on them by Winthrop in his capacity not as an investor, but as governor of the United Colonies, only to call in that loan a year later, when if the sachems, of course, could not pay that loan back, the Atherton Group seized the land that they had forced them to put up as collateral for the loan, thereby claiming themselves to be property owners of this large swath of Narragansett territory. There are two things I kind of want to mention, sort of observe about the Atherton incident, or the Atherton affair, which goes on for decades. First, and I think probably less important, but germane to the story I'm telling, highlighted the growing tensions over the boundaries of the New England colonies, as both Connecticut, and Providence plantations claimed the Narragansett territory as falling under its jurisdiction. And Rhode Island officials in particular insisting further that the deal itself was invalid, as it expressly violated the prohibitions in Rhode Island law against making private purchases of indigenous territory or making private bargains or deals at all. For their part, the Atherton partners denied they had actually purchased the land at all, claiming instead what they had done is basically foreclose on a mortgage. They also claimed the other lands were gifts. That was very hard to figure. Winthrop went to London to try to secure royal confirmation that the Atherton lands were in Connecticut. What he left with, he also was trying to find the original patent for the Sabre Company, which for some reason no one could seem to find. What he left with in 1662, like Rhode Island's agent that followed, were corporate charters for their colonies themselves, the governor and company of the English colony of Connecticut and of Rhode Island and Providence plantations in New England and America, respectively. These charters, or at least the Rhode Island charter, however, came with a catch. Inserted now for the first time was the explicit right for colonies to appeal intercolonial conflicts to the crown to settle their disputes. So what followed was a royal commission sent to New England to do a number of things. Most of its laundry list of objectives was actually to continue to settle ways in which the crown was upset with Massachusetts for doing things it didn't like, and also claims by Gorges and Mason's grandchildren to their territory, but also to settle the new possession of Dutch New Netherlands, which had just been transferred in the Anglo-Dutch War to the English crown, who then granted it as a proprietorship to his brother, and subsequently became named after him, the Duke of York, as New York. But this commission also was sent to arbitrate the dispute over the Narragansett lands. They declared the lands to be within Rhode Island. When they did so, the Atherton settlers just refused to leave. And Winthrop managed to persuade the commissioners to allow them to stay, even if the lands were to be in Rhode Island, but to claim these not as sovereign territory, but rather as private property. And the group eventually came to be known as the proprietors of the Narragansett country. The idea that the lands could be given back to the Narragansett never entered into the equation. So as one of these examples I'm trying to sort of suggest, among many, where perhaps more importantly than even the intercolonial disputes, was the ways in which this kind of joint stock enterprise and the drawn-out affair could tell us about what has become a prolific and pervasive strategy of dispossessing indigenous territory by rendering it as the property of joint stock companies and towns. It was not just that companies and joint stock towns could pool resources more effectively than private individuals. There was also the question, such as Rhode Island had raised, of just who was allowed to make purchases, contracts, and treaties with indigenous peoples in the first place. This was at least the issue at stake in another dispute that ensued in the 1680s, when several Massachusetts residents came forward claiming to have purchased land in the Connecticut town of Fairfield, among many other places, from the executors of the estate of one John Wampus. Wampus, whose story has been told brilliantly in a book by Jenny Pulsifer, was a Harvard-educated Nipmuc land speculator and mariner who had spent decades trying to make good on his claims to vast tracts of land, eventually even securing a charter from Charles II to such an effect. When he died, he left a portion of these lands to be managed by two friends, the merchant Edward Pratt and the sailor John Blake, who proceeded to sell off the rest, including lands that had for decades been located in Fairfield. When the current occupants in Fairfield refused to yield, the purchasers sued. Before a jury in Fairfield, William Pitkin, the lawyer for the two current residents, insisted that they held their lands through layers of corporate claims: a grant from the town of Fairfield, which derived its authority from the conquest of the Pequot 50 years earlier, confirmed in turn by a grant from the Connecticut General Court, whose authority was rooted in the colony's corporate charter as a governor and company of Connecticut. Where Rhode Island had argued that the Atherton Company was a group of private persons and therefore unable to make such a deal, Pitkin argued that Fairfield, as a corporation derived from corporations, was a public body authorized to do so. Thus, even if Wampus's original claims had been legitimate, he also argued they weren't. But even if Wampus's claims had been legitimate, quote unquote, particular persons like Pratt and Blake, or those to whom they sold the land, were not eligible, like Fairfield, to make such a deal. The difference was not just, however, because Fairfield was a town and Atherton a group of land speculators. Fairfield's argument was essentially the same argument bodies like the East India Company, Royal African Company, and Hudson's Bay Company had or would make in defense of their exclusive privileges and against so-called, quote, private or mere traders. As East India Company Governor Josiah Child put it, to give over traffic and intercourse with the non-Christian world to the, quote, divided, various, and contrary interests of raw and private persons was simply madness. Pitkin made the connection explicitly. Fairfield, he argued in the suit, was thus claiming, quote, no more than what all corporations almost enjoy, adding that, quote, in the Turkey, Guinea, East India corporations, the trade is restrained to the company, and without such laws, no body's politic can subsist, but interlopers would ruin all. In this sense, the rival claimants in Fairfield were no less interlopers than one Thomas Sands, against whom the East India Company was at the very same time prosecuting a case in the Court of King's Bench for violating the East India Company's charter in the East Indies. Both Fairfield and the East India Company won their cases. In this sense, various forms of joint stock towns and companies, even if structured differently, worked together or in tandem to forward the expansion of New England's borders. Into the mid-18th century, such efforts would reach as far afield as the Wyoming Valley and what is now Pennsylvania to the Floridas. Yet the corporate status of both the New England colonies and the towns and companies that emerged from them were by no means self-evident. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that even if their corporate status could be made clear, what that meant was by no means a settled question of law. There was, of course, the problem that English common law at least only recognized corporations chartered by the Crown or Parliament or their deputies. Furthermore, where most common lawyers might have admitted the right of someone like William Penn to make a corporation, they would have insisted that corporations themselves, even those like Massachusetts and Connecticut, could not. Corporations by the common law could not produce other corporations, did so all the time. There were also, of course, continued efforts by rival claimants and state officials to rein in the New England charters themselves. The Massachusetts Bay Company finally fell to a successful writ of Scarifacius in 1684 and to the establishment of the Dominion of New England in 1685. And when the corporate colony, though not the company, was restored after the Glorious Revolution, its autonomy was significantly diminished, not least as it was now subjected to a royally appointed governor. Both the Board of Trade and Parliament would try several times in the early 18th century to withdraw or subsume corporate charters, either through similar legal actions or legislation, laying the ground for its most famous and consequential efforts in the 1760s and 1770s to impose new taxes and regulations on the colonies. Quote, an English colony is a corporation, the theologian John Wesley wrote in 1775, and quote, as a corporation, they make laws for themselves, but as a corporation subsisting by a grant from higher authority to the control of that authority, they still continue subject. Both Thomas Pownall and Thomas Hutchinson, royal governors of Massachusetts, at various points compared the colonies to, in Hutchinson's words, quote, the East India and other great companies, which might exercise some prerogatives of government, but were ultimately subject to crown sovereignty. Of course, not everyone, not least the East India Company, would have necessarily agreed with the premise of this statement. Certainly by the 1760s, the East India Company's growing territorial power in Bengal was bringing into focus just how unsettled the nature of company sovereignty was. That is a matter for another talk. But for our purposes here, William Samuel Johnson, who was in London in the late 1760s as Connecticut's agent, was having an extremely hard time getting any business done, as he reported back to officials in Connecticut, because of all the attention being given to the East India issues. But he argued in the context that even if the New England colonies were like urban boroughs, not all urban boroughs were created equally. Just as London was of a different order than, quote, a petty corporation in Cornwall, colonial charters were, quote, in several respects of a higher nature and founded upon a better title than even that of the corporations of England. A few years later, the Massachusetts House of Representatives pointed out some further differences still, such as the fact that unlike English corporations, colonial corporations could make other corporations. Again, a debated point. And of course, English municipalities were represented in the House of Commons, which quite notoriously American colonies were not. Thus, if Massachusetts were a corporation, the Assembly says, it was, quote, in no other light than as every state is a corporation. Even if this were not the case, though, Johnson argued, as others had before him, that the fact that its property rights and settlement had been organized and paid for by colonists, not the crown, meant that its charters were, quote, grants upon valuable consideration, that same phrase that Winthrop had used, sacred and most inviolable. That is to say, they were property. Such an argument even found its way into the iconic list of grievances against George III in the Declaration of Independence. Quote, we have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, Thomas Jefferson wrote, having dropped from the final version an even more pointed line he'd included an earlier draft. Quote, that these were effected at the expense of our own blood and treasure, unassisted by the wealth or the strength of Great Britain. Despite the ambivalence about the corporation and its nature in the throes of the American Revolution, the corporate tradition built on these colonial frameworks would, of course, endure to shape the expansion of the new American Republic's empire in countless ways. From a wave of early 19th century land companies that led the charts to dispossess indigenous territories in the West, through the expansion of the railroads, into the expansion of 20th century companies like United Fruit in Latin America, as elsewhere. Meanwhile, 17th century America continued to loom large in the colonial 19th century British imagination. Perhaps no more notably than in Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a leading voice in an 1830s project for a company to colonize South Australia, who fashioned himself quite literally as a sort of latter-day William Penn. Others recalled this history to make the converse point about government-led empire. After all, the East India Company Administrator John Kay acerbically reminded his readers in 1858 in the wake of the Government India Act, America was once a colony, and it was lost to you by parliamentary government. Though by the later 19th century, it seemed as if an era had ended. Both the East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, most notably having ceased as colonial governments, their examples continued to inform new colonial ventures from the Falklands to Borneo, and most pervasively in the so-called scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, which was in large part a trans-European corporate competition fueled by any number of arguments that would have been remarkably familiar centuries earlier. Not least among these was the argument of history itself. The British colonial enterprise should be done by companies, since advocates insisted that was the way it had always been done. Thus, in 1898, almost 125 years to today, the historian and former Indian civil servant Alfred Lyall gave his own lecture before the Society of Arts in London, in which he laid out a history going back to the medieval world to show just how companies had, quote, played a very great part in, quote, founding, extending, and consolidating the vast dominion of Great Britain across the seas. As he argued, there are some things which a government cannot do officially, and which are best accomplished when the people take the lead, while the state lends its support, remaining in the background until it is required to interfere. Colonization is certainly one of those things. Commerce is another. The most famous and influential example of this, he suggested, was, of course, in India, by Lyall's erstwhile employer. But as Lyall observed, at the end of the 18th century, the East India Company was ruling Bengal by the authority of a royal charter precisely similar to that under which a governor and company had taken possession a century or more earlier of Massachusetts. At the eve of the 20th century, Lyall, like others in almost every generation before him, also predicted that this era had perhaps finally come to a close. Listening on to his lecture was Henry Morton Stanley, the explorer and former agent for the Belgian King Leopold II and his colonial corporation in the Congo, who could not help but agree, though the fact he reported left him feeling saddened and rather melancholy. Yet once again, the rumors of the death of corporate empire may have been vastly exaggerated. Into the 20th century, from the Middle East to the Malvinas, corporations continued to play a central role in governing empire and in many ways shaping its end. This tradition's legacy can be seen around the post-colonial world, not least in the genetics of any number of modern companies, such as Unilever, whose early West African investments were facilitated by absorbing the Royal Niger Company's corporate descendant, or De Beers, the British South Africa Company subsidiary, which, like the diamonds it advertises, might very well possibly last forever. More generally, looking to the history of corporations in such distant times and places can help us rethink more critically about the ways in which the lines between public and private life continue to blur, if not disappear entirely. Its echoes can be seen in multinational military corporations that continue to fight wars, global mining concerns that run with local police forces, and multinational oil and gas conglomerates that engage in what the journalist Steve Call has shown in his excellent book on ExxonMobil amount to their own foreign policy. After all, those of you following the news on this will have learned far more than you ever wanted to know in recent months about the Walt Disney Corporation's essentially self-governing status in Central Florida. You're perhaps no doubt at least casually aware of the grand plans Elon Musk has for his company SpaceX to lead the way to travel and settle Mars. Conversely, I doubt you were all too shocked by the talk in the wake of the death of Queen Elizabeth II about the labyrinthine commercial, land, and financial holdings of the British royal family, some of which date back to the 13th century, and of a crown that even Elizabeth's father, King George VI, reportedly referred to as, quote unquote, the firm. Thus, if the history of corporate colonialism teaches us anything, it is that the corporation produces by its nature a set of dilemmas I don't think we have quite managed to resolve. Is it real or is it a legal fiction? Is it a person or a form of society? To whom is it accountable? Its history also suggests a way of thinking about empire less as a concert and more as a cacophony, a dynamic of competing and conflicting ideas and interests that dug deep into medieval and legal and financial traditions, often contorting them to strategies that in turn and over time enabled and normalized dispossession of and rule over indigenous peoples and the settlements of Europeans across the globe. I suppose is my argument then in this book that the corporation was especially well suited to colonial expansion, neither because it was some inevitable all-consuming juggernaut, nor a self-evident extension of the interests and impulses of the state or of capitalism, but rather, like empire itself, a paradox, public and private, mercantilist and capitalist, person and association, sycophantic and rebellious, regional and global, immortal and fragile, smugly patriotic and belligerently cosmopolitan. It was thus in this sense that the joint stock corporation managed to become a cornerstone of a British empire that it turned out was never fully owned nor operated by Britain itself. Thank you.
I'm sure Dr. Stern would be happy to take questions if we have any.
I think
if there's a plaque on the old State House with the Massachusetts Bay Company on the outside of the building. So I just noticed that a few days ago for the first time.
I got to put that on the cover of the next edition. Okay. That's great. Thanks.
I heard you say Walt Disney. Can you tell me what is it? And how long have they been, how did it get there? How did, Walt Disney get this, these charters or whatever it is that they're investing in from South Africa? Yeah.
So, I talk about that a little at my peril. I know what everybody else knows just from watching this, but currently what I was referring to is this ongoing battle that the Disney Corporation is having with Ron DeSantis in Florida. But going back decades, I think to the middle of the 20th century, I think when Disney sort of established Disney World in Florida, I have a horribly traumatic story of my parents trying to take me to Disney World and them driving right past it and never going there. So this all brings up really bad memories for me. But the deals that the Disney Corporation made with Florida at that time created what was essentially a kind of separate governing body for the land and territory that was in that area that basically allowed for Disney to both develop some of its own towns, the town like Celebration, but also to set taxes and to do control public works and things like this. I probably have a lot of these details wrong for anybody who knows more about this, but essentially this is sort of persisted to this day. And this battle, so this battle is now over the governor of Florida for political reasons having to, I think, do with the presidential campaign but really now I'm really out of my depth. I work with people who have been dead for 400 years, but it mirrors this kind of way in which we think of, well, a company is in Florida, but actually the map of Florida has this big hole in the middle where the Disney Corporation and some of its assignees have much more power to govern over local governance than we think. And that's probably all I should say about that before I go way off my expertise.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And it's, I wonder if you could comment a little more or give us some observations on the fluidity of some of these structures. And you talked a little bit about Plymouth and Massachusetts, and you have this case where Plymouth receives, they create a joint stock company under the auspices of the London, Virginia Company. They go outside the territory, so they get a second patent, a new patent from what becomes the Council of New England, which disappears.
Right.
They never get a royal charter. They have no legal authority to govern. There seems to be like everything in the landscape is shifting dramatically here, and nobody seems to be terribly worried about it.
I think Plymouth, they were very worried about it. I mean, I mean, to take your point, I think you're right about this in the sense that historically, it's quite amazing how many of the institutions that I'm sort of tracing, and Plymouth is an iconic example, can endure without the charters or without the thing you think legally is the basis, the foundation for that. The one I'm currently most obsessed with, the example of this, is one I mentioned only obliquely here, but didn't have time to talk about, which is something I'm writing a much more extensive material on right now, which is a company in Connecticut in the middle of the 18th century that attempts to colonize in the Wyoming Valley near current-day Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, despite the fact that that territory was also claimed by Pennsylvania. And one of the interesting things about that company is that despite the fact they call themselves a corporation, try to get a charter out of the king, try to get a charter out of Connecticut, they never actually are chartered. And one of the, I don't make this argument very strongly, I'm not sure if I would, how much I want to back it up, but the company actually endures through the American Revolution. One of the reasons that seems to be able to do so is because it doesn't have a charter. And so as a result, there's no controversy or question over what happens to it. The problem with that argument is that a lot of institutions from universities to companies also endure with charters through the the revolution. So that's also, it's hard to sort of work that out. But the bigger point I think you're making is that it's interesting that what joint stock and corporate status, which are sometimes linked together in these institutions, but I sometimes trace them separately, they provide almost layers of protection, which allow you to sort of immunize yourself against these kinds of actions at various levels, right? And so Plymouth can continue to sort of endure, but its agents are extremely concerned at each of these points. Each of these moments, with the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company, for example, the attempt to get a corporate charter seems to be rather urgent, because this is the way they think that you will actually sort of protect these rights in law. But as we see in all these other places, those charters are, broadly unenforceable outside of England. I mean, they carry great political weight. They do carry legal weight. They're absolutely critical. But your point is absolutely right, that it's a lot of these other strategies which can help to sort of make up for the absence of a charter or the unenforceability of a charter or a rival charter. There's a great example of this, which I don't talk about much in this book. I do in my other book, about when they're in the 1690s, when two East India companies are created at the same time. Well, a new East India Company is created to sort of challenge the old East India Company. The old East India Company is told to wrap up its business, and it employs a number of strategies to stay alive, one of which is investing in the new company and then saying, we now have property, you can't disband us. And the two companies end up uniting in 1709 into a merger. So I don't know if that answered your question, but you're absolutely right. It's really quite remarkable. That's kind of the phenomenon the book traces in all kinds of different ways at different points in time.
We have a question online from John. He's discussing the work of Nick Mansfield and saying that by 1815, the East India Company had over 250,000 troops, and wonders if you could discuss the military capabilities of these corporations. Oh,
yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think the East India Company and a number of these other sort of larger territorial companies are remarkable examples of the capacity both of mobilizing money, but also mobilizing various forms of rights of sovereignty to sort of to have these kinds of sort of armed forces. But the other side of that, and I think the East India Company in particular is iconic in that regard, both for the fact that it raises this massive army and that the vast majority of those soldiers are not Europeans. Right, they're South Asians and drawn from a labor market across South Asia and even further afield. I would also add to that story about troops that this is also a story about the fluid, no pun intended, relationship between am I being gonged off? Between maritime power and territorial power in the form of armies. So the ability to have ships and raise navies is also an absolutely critical part of this. And the two are related to each other. So I tell a story, for example, in the book about the Imperial British East Africa Company, which essentially is, for lack of time, I'll just leave it at, begins with its sort of progenitor, William Mackinnon's shipping interests in India that then sort of dovetail into connections to its kind of territorial power in East Africa. That said, I just want to say very quickly, there are a lot of companies, a lot of these joint stock enterprises in this book that do not look like that do not raise armies, or whose armies are like here in these early days of Massachusetts and New England, militias, or cobbled together in a variety of ways. So at our peril, we kind of focus on these bigger stories, so these bigger, more kind of striking moments of these armed companies, which I don't dismiss at all, is absolutely critical. But it also distracts us from all of these other ways in which sovereignty and power or jurisdiction in various different places and time are exerted through other forms of authority. But violence is absolutely key to it.
This is very rich material you have presented, so I need to read the book to digest it all. But my question is, you must have looked at the financial statements of these corporations, right?
So
some of them. Yeah. But how do you treat, or how you touched in the book, the slavery issue, the unpaid labor, and how are you dealing with it? Yeah. Because both in the United States, I mean, before independence and even after, but also in the rest of the world, how is the unpaid labor, and how do you deal with that? adequately, especially at a time like 2023?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
No, that's an absolutely fantastic question. It comes up in a number of different really important ways. The premise to your question, I'll say, actually is worth doing, and I haven't done, which is to try to figure out how to account for the financial value of that labor in this joint stock model. That is one thing, because of the nature of the book and how quick it is with all these different companies. I sort of haven't reconstituted, but it's absolutely the case in a number of places. That said, there are a variety of ways in which this joint stock model underscores the history of slavery and enslavement. So the earliest 16th century voyages, for example, English slaving voyages, those of John Hawkins, for example, were under kind of joint stock enterprises. Even through to the 18th and 19th century, you had joint stock slaving company, or joint stock slaving partnerships that were absolutely critical to the forwarding of the slave trade. But there's the book is filled with contradictions and kinds of, but also, right, because there's also a way in which and other people have written about this more extensively and deeply than I have, that it was actually the dismantling of the Royal African Company, which was created in the Restoration in the 1660s, the dismantling of its exclusive trade and the opening up of that trade to competition of non-corporate bodies that actually catapulted the British trade in slaves across the Atlantic. So the 18th century explosion can be traced in part to the opening of the Royal African Company's monopoly. But many of those slave voyages through the late 18th century were financed by joint stock capital, right? But by not individuals, but by people coming together. The same could be said, for example, of piracy in the 16th century, including a number of voyages, including those two that are normally associated with the Earl of Warwick in 1619, which were the two ships that brought the first enslaved peoples from stolen off of a Portuguese ship first to Point Comfort in Virginia as well. So joint stock models are underneath these in a lot of different ways. It gets more, I can talk to you more about it later. It's kind of complicated, but I also want to say that there's a complication as well where slavery also balloons in places that are not corporate colonies like Jamaica, right? So untangling that is a kind of very complicated question, but I appreciate the question. It's a really, really important one.
I would like to thank Dr. Stern for a wonderful lecture. I would like to let people know that we have books for sale in the lobby. We also have the exhibition is a small collection of material related to the book is available for viewing in the Douse Library. And anyone who is joining us online, I hope they will consider buying a book from their favorite online retailer, perhaps books.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you.